I want to welcome folks back to another Zoom conversation. This is our 27th episode since the pandemic started. And our guest today is author and journalist Larry Tye, who has written a biography of Joseph McCarthy, Demagogue, The Life and Long Shadow of Senator Joseph McCarthy. So we're going to talk about that today. I had a chance to appear on a Maine public radio show, Maine Calling with Larry, right before the election. But I wanted to follow up and have a chance for the two of us to have a more extended conversation. So welcome.
So it's great to be with you.
And where are you coming to us from?
I'm coming from a village that probably nobody's ever heard of called Cotuit, which is smack in the middle of Cape Cod, not far from the Kennedy compound and not far from the beach.
Very good. And how have you been dealing with the pandemic?
I've been dealing with it in a frenetic way, which is my book came out last summer, and nobody knew at that moment what a book tour was going to look like in the middle of pandemic. And I have done 2 to 3 times more talks than any of my previous 7 books to audiences that were 2 to 3 times bigger. And it is about half as much fun. One of the things you do after you spend all this time in isolation working on a book, you can't wait to get out and see real people and to travel the country. And the furthest I've made it, my only 2 live talks were within spitting distance of me on Cape Cod, and they were in a baseball stadium where normally the Cape Cod Baseball League would be playing games. And instead, they had carefully marked off 6 feet apart seats where people could come and in lieu of a baseball game, listen to me throwing stones at Joe McCarthy. And that was the...
Well, we'll talk more about that because in a way, what I liked about the book is you don't just cast stones at Joe McCarthy. And we'll talk more about that, but I want to follow up on this element of the pandemic. It's what got us started doing these conversations. And being an author myself, it's a very solitary experience. Doing the research is very solitary. Doing the writing is even more solitary. As you say, one of the great joys is then being able to go out and talk about this project that you've been working on for a long time. And so I'm sorry that you've been robbed of that experience.
So that is a joy. What I have been done, I am obsessive and frenetic enough that I have written, I think I just did my 49th op-ed. And there is an endless appetite during a pandemic when so little of conventional news is happening. There's an endless appetite of newspapers and magazines for stories revisiting history of the kind that you write and that I write. And I have been shameless in capitalizing on that and on a sad trend in journalism, which is that newspapers have laid off most of their in-house columnists. So if authors will write for them, and especially for free, they will print things. So yesterday was the New York Times, and that was on a side topic. It was actually on Satchel, Paige, and the Negro Leagues. But you just go out there and write the time that you would spend traveling around the country doing a book tour. You can spend sitting at your desk writing more things.
We hopefully will also have a chance to get to that. You've written a wide range of topics, including Satchel Paige, which I assume that was because the Negro Leagues are in the news and that Major League Baseball has decided to include their records as part of the official baseball record.
Yes, so you're a good historian and a good baseball fan, and that's exactly the reason. And my piece said, on the one hand, kudos to Major League for doing this, but as always, they were very late with what they did and 2 steps behind what they ought to have done. So that in redressing a racist pass, they took an important baby step.
Right. And then the other element to pick up on is you say you've actually, in a way, been able to reach more people, even though you haven't been able to go out and do the traditional book tour. And, there is something lost in not being able to have that direct one-on-one relationships and contact with people, but then technology does broaden the audience that we can reach. I mean, that's one of the reasons we decided to keep doing these Zoom conversations, is that they reach a lot more people than we could ever reach if we just held an event right here at the library.
Exactly. So that I'm told at some of these events that the Zoom numbers you can see on a screen, and the Zoom numbers have approached 500. But I'm told after the fact, I did a talk a week ago at the co-sponsored by the Carter Presidential Library and Center in Georgia, and one at the LBJ Library and at the JFK Library. And people say who run these library events, and I don't know if it's self-serving, but you would know better because you are a master at this, that in addition to the people who tune in live for them, that when you have them on the site, that potentially hundreds or more people come afterwards and can see them at any moment. And so that is a scary thing if you mess up on it, and an exciting thing.
True.
Because what an author is trying to do, you've already sold your book and you've gotten your advance, and what you're really trying to do is tell your story to as many people as possible, whether or not they ever buy a book. And this gives one more chance to tell it to a wider audience. So.
Yeah, we post them immediately on Facebook, but then we archive them on a YouTube channel. So yeah, it'll be out there for quite some time.
Great.
So let's get to the topic. Why a biography of Joe McCarthy? There are quite a number of biographies. As I went to get our copy of your book, we have a whole shelf of Joe McCarthy biographies.
Yes, so the less politely phrased, the question is, why does the world need the 101st biography in Joe McCarthy? And the answer is twofold. I'll give you the honest answer and then a more historian or authorial answer. The honest answer is, I wanted to write it and I convinced my publisher to let me write it. But the answer for readers and for historians is that I had access to materials that nobody had ever seen before. One was a set of documents, 9,000 pages of transcripts of the hearings that Joe McCarthy held behind closed doors, which were 2/3 of the hearings that he held. And for 50 years, those were under lock and key. And a number of years ago, a senator from Maine named Susan Collins and a colleague who had chaired the same subcommittee that Susan Collins did and that Joe McCarthy did, named Carl Levin from Michigan, both decided, a Democrat and a Republican, counterintuitively got together and agreed on something. And the agreement was these papers, which had been sequestered for 50 years, the public deserved to see them. And as I say, 9,000 pages of transcripts. They had been out there. Journalists had done a couple stories on them, but the guy who was the official historian of the US Senate who curated their release, it was an old friend, and he's been whispering in my ear for years saying, these documents are extraordinary and you've got to take a deep look and write about McCarthy. And they showed two things in very short form. One is that they showed that any limited pretense of Joe McCarthy actually respecting the rights of the people who came before him went out the window when the cameras went out the door. And you didn't want to be appearing before Joe McCarthy behind closed doors. The other thing you didn't want to happen is you didn't want to be appearing before Joe McCarthy in the afternoon, because in the morning when he was stone cold sober, his hearings were relatively reasonable. In the afternoon, after he had his trademark lunch of a hamburger, a raw onion, and lots of whiskey to wash it down, any fuse that he had got that much shorter, and any patience he had with witnesses went out the window. And in the afternoon, Joe McCarthy could destroy you as a witness. So one set of documents that I had that people hadn't examined were these closed door testimony. The Golden Grail set of documents, which Joe McCarthy's widow had left to his alma mater library, to Marquette University, shortly after he died, were all of his personal and professional papers. Everything from his love letters to his wife, to what he really thought of Margaret Chase Smith, to everything that historians had been eager to see, for 70 years since Joe McCarthy died, I got a chance to see. And I would like to tell you that McCarthy's daughter gave me the access she hadn't given anybody else, because I was so charming that she couldn't resist. But if you don't already know, you will know by the end of this interview that it sure as heck wasn't my charm. And why she decided to let me see them, I don't know, but she did, and I was delighted, and the archivists at Marquette were delighted, and they showed Joe McCarthy being better than we thought he was about certain things like his wartime records,
Mm-hmm.
and being even more venal than we thought he was about other things. So set number 2 is all these personal and professional papers. The third and last set of documents that I got to see were his military records and something that every biographer dreams of, but nobody generally gets to see, were all of his medical records. From the day that he took office in the Senate to the day that he died, he was a regular patient at Bethesda Naval Hospital.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a provision in the federal records law that after 50 years, if somebody is a public enough figure, that we can see their medical records.
Mm-hmm.
But generally, it's easier for all the government record keeping agencies. They can say yes and they can say no. And it's a whole lot easier, and they take a lot less flack for saying no, because there's only some obscure author angry at them. Then they're saying yes, when lots of doctors and lots of people who adore or hate that figure suddenly get a chance to see what their records really looked like. And one day, when my wife and I were out with the dog for a very early morning walk from our village on Cape Cod, we saw an enormous brown box at the head of our driveway. And that turned out to be 5,000 pages of medical records.
Wow.
And I sat down with the just retired dean of the Harvard Medical School, with the just retired editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, and with 2 other smart doctors. We read every one of those 5,000 pages. And what they showed as the headline version is that Joe McCarthy didn't die of the acute hepatitis that the coroner told us he died of.
Mm-hmm.
He died of alcohol poisoning.
Mm-hmm.
He was an alcoholic from his early days in the Senate. That goes a long way to explaining a lot of the behavior. And in the end, after he was censured by the Senate, he became enough of an alcoholic that he was drinking the equivalent of a 5th of whiskey every day. And that's what he died of. And it was tragic and it was sad. And as I say, it explains a whole lot about Joe McCarthy. So the bottom line, my end of my answer, a very long-winded answer to your short question, is that with all this new material,
Mm-hmm.
if I couldn't write a book that justified the 101st biography, then shame on me.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as I was reading through it, I think one of the points is the Joe McCarthy we think we know, we don't know entirely, because on both sides there's a stereotype of Joe McCarthy. And what you're trying to do with this new material that you're able to access is to give a fuller picture of the real Joe McCarthy.
So that is true. What I was trying to do with this book is do 2 things. One is precisely what you said, give a fuller picture of McCarthy. And the other was to suggest, and the title of the book, the one-word title Demagogue, is trying to suggest that he wasn't the first demagogue in American history, that we have a long, uniquely American strain of demagoguery going back to people like the racist Senator Theodore Bilbo and the would-be dictator Huey Long of Louisiana, and that we have a lot of demagogues who came afterwards, and we can talk about some of them up to this present day. What made McCarthy different is that he was the archetype. He borrowed from and refined the playbooks of all those who came before, and he set up the playbook for every demagogue who came after, including one who we can talk about today.
Was he that conscious about it? Did he, in his mind, did he know he was being the archetype demagogue? And did he study previous demagogues?
So I love that question. And no, he never had the patience, and he was never the historian to have truly gone back and studied the ones who came before. He never had the patience to write a conscious playbook. And yet he was so instinctual in what he did. It is not accidental that this man who was not the orchestrator or the architect of the Red Scare, he is the one whose name is associated with the Red Scare more than anybody.
Mm-hmm.
He's the one who has an entire ism named after him in the form of McCarthyism.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because whether he was a historian and he wasn't, whether he was a patient architect of demagoguery and he wasn't, he got what it meant to be a demagogue and how to play on public fears and fan those fears. He understood that so well that he didn't have to write the formal playbook, but he was the one who coined the term and who became a movement and who became the archetype.
Mm-hmm. Did Roy Cohn have the playbook?
Roy Cohn has been blamed by a lot of people, including Bobby Kennedy, for being the one who told Joe McCarthy how to do all the bad things he did. And if it hadn't been for Roy Cohn, we would never have had this evil Joe McCarthy. And that simply isn't true. Roy Cohn was the protege. Joe McCarthy was the mentor. Roy Cohn, on the one hand, did reinforce all the bad instincts of Joe McCarthy, but the instincts were McCarthy's, and Cohn was the one who learned the lessons and 50 years later passed them on to people like Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm. Another element, as I was rereading the book that you mentioned, is in some way it gets connected to the biography you've done of Bobby Kennedy.
So it's very much connected. And it was doing the Bobby Kennedy biography, and it was especially for the Bobby Kennedy biography, I interviewed 450 people. But among those 450, there was only one that was truly essential. And that was a woman named Ethel Kennedy, Bobby's, not just Bobby's wife and widow, but his alter ego. And Ethel Kennedy told me things about Joe McCarthy that made me, in the back of my head, even as I was focused on writing the Bobby Kennedy biography, know that someday I had to do something on Joe McCarthy. And what she said that really stuck with me is, Joe McCarthy might be a villain to much of America, but to Bobby and me, he was just plain good fun.
Mm-hmm.
And the thought of Joe McCarthy as good fun was so counterintuitive that I knew someday I'd have to come back and do something on Joe McCarthy.
Mm-hmm. And it comes across that he had this engaging, somewhat charismatic element about him.
He did. So again, I don't want to, this is not a discussion of Donald Trump, but I would say about Donald Trump that I would never especially want to go out for a drink if I had the opportunity with Donald Trump. But with Joe McCarthy, I would have loved to have gone out for a drink many nights. And he was such an entertaining character. And when he wasn't being evil, he was being just plain good fun, the way Ethel Kennedy said. So he was a really contradictory and therefore more appealing character to me. And he was, as we will, I presume, discuss, he was somebody that when she wasn't hating him, Margaret Chase Smith was charmed by him because he was that kind of person.
Mm-hmm.
If you didn't find him confounding at a moment, you could find him ultimately charming.
Well, I wanted to share some photos. I'm going to do that right now. And there are 3 photos, and they're from 1949. So this is before McCarthy has made his speech in Wheeling, West Virginia in February of 1950. And you can see that, there they are right next to each other, giving a farewell toast.
Oh, I love it. So I love that for 2 reasons. One is because that shows them in this clearly friendly setting, but I also love it because if you had looked at that picture and predicted history, you would have said Margaret Chase Smith would become a famous and iconic senator, which you could argue she did become, and you would have said at that moment in 1949 that Joe McCarthy was destined to be a one-term senator that nobody ever heard of.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, his name has become part of lore, and she's become only remembered because great libraries like yours do things to remind us why we ought to care about her. But I think that what happened in 1950, just months after this picture, changed everything.
And here's the two of them on preparing for what were called the 5%er hearings. But again,
Great hearing.
right next to one another. And this is a photo from the Marquette University collection.
That's a wonderful picture. God, those two women are characters. Wow.
Yeah. It's probably in Washington, but it's the two women are unidentified.
So can I just say one thing about this picture? That
Sure.
suggests that McCarthy and Smith were friends, and
Yeah.
they were friends. And he was talking about her being a vice presidential or presidential possibility, and he was going to be a sponsor of hers. And he really thought she was terrific until she had the courage to do something that made him think she wasn't so terrific. But
Mm-hmm. So you had mentioned having access to the Marquette University collection, and you had alluded to you were able to find out what Joe McCarthy really thought of Margaret Chase Smith after these happy days of 1949. So what did he think?
So I think he thought that she was somebody who he had befriended and offered to do big things for, become sort of a sponsor. He brought her onto his famous subcommittee. He just had all these grand plans for her. And it was probably a very chauvinist thing that he was thinking that she needed a sponsor like him. But after that, he thought she was somebody who he was going to do everything he could to destroy. And he helped recruit somebody who ran against her in the primary. He never really got just how talented and how popular Margaret Chase Smith was. But I think he did, while he didn't do her great electoral damage, I think he created great angst for her and made her life as miserable as Joe McCarthy could do. And when he wanted to make somebody's life miserable, he could do that. The great thing is she was one of the few political figures who, when McCarthy targeted her, she survived and ultimately thrived, but it was not without a cost.
Mm-hmm. Is there much in the McCarthy papers about Margaret Chase Smith?
There's never what I would have loved to have seen, which is how he truly felt about her, but it didn't take a whole lot of guessing to know how he truly felt about her, because there was material in those papers and everywhere about him recruiting a candidate to run against her in the primary and all that he did. But I think that I wish he had been more revealing. And Joe McCarthy, number one, wasn't a very good writer. And number two, when he was writing things, it was generally for political purposes. So while those papers were, among some things, very revealing, how he felt about Margaret Chase Smith, which I would have loved to have known, and whether he had any romantic interest, there were always these sort of undercurrents that I think Joe McCarthy liked to flame, that everybody was in love with him, Joe McCarthy. And whether Margaret Chase Smith was ever intrigued romantically about Joe McCarthy, and whether McCarthy was ever intrigued about her, those kinds of smoking guns, we might call them, were never there in the papers that I saw.
There's not a whiff of any romantic interest from our side of the papers.
Yes, and I think Joe McCarthy's suggestion of that over the years was just one more way of his saying that she didn't really have anything on him, but she was a woman somehow scorned, and therefore she was angry and went after him. And there's no evidence of that anywhere.
There's after things sort of blew up on him, I think this is like 1955 or 56. He sends a letter to her saying, can't we be friends? And she very curtly responds to it, no.
Yes. So after 1954, when McCarthy was censured and embarrassed by the Senate, he was, for much of the rest of his life, a man who was unable to piece together any semblance of sort of a career and of a path forward. His drinking became of alcoholic proportions, and the papers suggest that he was a very sad character. So he was reaching out to Margaret Chase Smith and to everybody and people generally disdained him the same way he had done with them when he was at his nadir, at his heyday.
What was the most surprising thing you found in your research about Joe McCarthy?
Uh, so the most surprising thing was that he actually told the truth about things that we assumed, because he lied about so much, that he was lying about. And one of the things he told the truth about was his wartime record during World War II. That was a very important thing to people who had served in any war, and certainly during World War II. And Joe McCarthy called himself, when he ran his first campaign for senator, he dubbed himself Tail Gunner Joe. And that was meant as a serious thing, that he was this heroic tail gunner who went up over his South Pacific island and at great risk to himself flew heroic missions. That became a caricature of him that his critics used, because they said, you're calling yourself a tail gunner, but you were really a land-based intelligence officer, and any notion of your being a hero was only in your own mind. Well, it turns out we know from his records that he in fact was, as an official duty, a land-based intelligence officer, but he volunteered for one dangerous mission after another, served in many of those flights as a tail gunner, didn't have to do it, came under enemy fire, and he was precisely the hero that he said he was. But he lied about so much else that when he said, I'm a tail gunner, it was easy for people to say, no, that's just one more lie. And what is most surprising to me about that is the records of his heroic volunteering for these missions and the testimony of his fellow Marines from that South Pacific island that he was based on were there in his records that I got access to at Marquette University, these closed door records. And why he didn't stand up and say, I've got the proof, I never understand. And I think it was because he assumed the one thing that was sacred to this guy who lied about so much else and exaggerated so much, the one thing that was sacred was his real-time Marine Corps World War II service. And I think he might have felt, if people don't believe me about something as important and as sacred to me as my wartime military records, then the heck with them. I'm not going to pull out the records and show that I'm telling the truth.
What lessons do you think we can learn from Joe McCarthy?
So I think we can learn the lessons that Margaret Chase Smith was trying to teach us when she took on Joe McCarthy shortly after he started with all of these specious charges about communists in the State Department and throughout the US government. And the lessons are that when somebody exaggerates the way that Joe McCarthy did, that the press has got to truly stand up and call him out. And I think that much of the press back then realized that Joe McCarthy was putting them on page one every day, so they would reprint his charges, his specious charges about communists riddling the State Department and other agencies, because they knew those charges would put them on page one. And the rebuttals about the people who stood up and said, no, I can prove that I'm not what Joe McCarthy said I was, those came in a day after story. They came on page 15. And the lessons are that the press and fellow politicians, including Dwight Eisenhower, who knew that Joe McCarthy was a fraud, but decided that he was going to let McCarthy do himself in. The lessons are we've got to have more courageous politicians willing to stand up the way Margaret Chase Smith did and say the emperor has no clothes.
Well, it's interesting you say that because another passage I was looking through before the interview was the passage about John Kennedy. And, you know, you making the point, John Kennedy at this moment was not a profile in courage.
Yes. So John Kennedy famously wrote a book called Profiles in Courage.
Did he?
Where he stood up. He did. And well, he may have, or he clearly had some ghostwriters. And how much was his and how much were the ghostwriters, historians will argue about forever. And knowing the Kennedys the way I do and having written a biography on Bobby, the idea that any of them could write well enough to have written on their own a book like Profiles in Courage just doesn't wash with me. And I think that he clearly had some ghostwriting, and how much, I'm not sure. But John Kennedy was anything but a profile in courage when it came to Joe McCarthy. John Kennedy was grateful to Joe McCarthy when he, John Kennedy, ran for senator for the first time in 1952 and was taking on a very powerful Republican, very much in the model of Margaret Chase Smith, Henry Cabot Lodge, a Yankee, middle of the road Republican. John Kennedy knew that if Joe McCarthy came in and campaigned for Lodge the way Lodge wanted him to, that in a year that everybody knew was going to be an Eisenhower landslide, that Kennedy probably wouldn't survive. So John Kennedy, and more importantly, his dad, Joe Kennedy, asked Joe McCarthy, would you please stay out of Massachusetts?
Mhm.
Lodge invited McCarthy in. McCarthy, in deference to Joe Kennedy's friendship and his money that he had received over the years, Joe McCarthy stayed out of Massachusetts. That is why, while Eisenhower was winning Massachusetts by a landslide, Jack Kennedy squeaked in against Lodge and was forever grateful to Joe McCarthy for staying the heck out of Massachusetts.
Another point I want to pursue, because your background is in journalism, and some of your work still today is in journalism. Is journalism equipped to stand up to demagogues? And even in 1950, was it equipped to stand up to demagogues? Because the story of the movie about Edward R. Murrow that George Clooney did, Good Night and Good Luck, I think, is the fight that Murrow had to have with William Paley to get the shows on air.
Yes. So that fight between Murrow and McCarthy made for a terrific movie. George Clooney was great. But as Edward R. Murrow himself said, he was late to the game. He stood up against Joe McCarthy at the end of 1953 and in 1954, when it was easy to do that, when McCarthy had done most of his damage, and when McCarthy was nearing his own downfall in the Army McCarthy hearings. So even a powerful journalist like Edward R. Murrow, arguably the most influential journalist in America in that early 1950s era, came to the game late. The journalist who truly stood up to Joe McCarthy and who paid the price for it was the best read columnist in America at that time, a guy named Andrew Drew Pearson. And Pearson wrote nearly 60 scathing columns about Joe McCarthy shortly after McCarthy launched his crusade against communism. And Pearson paid two prices for that. One price was when the two of them met at a swank supper club in Washington. McCarthy started slapping Pearson around, and had it not been for a Quaker peacemaker named Richard Nixon, who stepped between the two of them, he probably would have pummeled Drew Pearson. He did pummel Drew Pearson in a different way on the floor of the Senate by attacking Pearson and going after Pearson's sponsor, a company called the Adam Hat Company that sponsored Drew Pearson's famous radio broadcasts.
Mhm.
He cost Drew Pearson a sponsor, he cost him a lot of money, and he cost him a lot of angst. And so even a powerful journalist like Drew Pearson had a very difficult time standing up to Joe McCarthy, which explains why so few journalists did stand up to Joe McCarthy.
Mhm.
It is not easy, as we've seen with Donald Trump, to stand up to a demagogue means paying a price.
Mhm.
And that's a scary thing. And not many journalists have the courage to do that.
And even being a politician with probably more power than a journalist, you pay a price. Margaret paid a price. And so let me ask you this question. Did the Declaration of Conscience, which is looked on by us and many others very reverentially, Peggy Noonan has just wrote a couple of columns about it in the Wall Street Journal in the past couple of weeks. Did it have any consequence in June and July and thereafter in 1950?
So I want to say two things. I want to back into it by commenting very quickly on the Peggy Noonan columns. And I'm delighted that she wrote her columns. It would have been a whole lot more courageous and effective to have written them before the election than after the election, when she suddenly has this newfound willingness to take on the demagogue in the White House today. But Margaret Chase Smith had real courage because she did it at a moment when Joe McCarthy was at the height of his political, personal popularity. She did it standing up to McCarthy at a moment when she knew that McCarthy was tantalizing her by saying, if you play along with me, I will make you potentially a vice presidential nominee in 1952, and someday you could be the first woman that I'd support for president. So he was enticing her. He was a threatening presence. She ignored all of that. When McCarthy was at his height, after his first attack on communists in the State Department in Wheeling, West Virginia in February 1950, not long after, Margaret Chase Smith stands up on the floor of the Senate with 6 fellow senators announcing her so-called Declaration of Conscience. There was nothing in it for her other than her integrity. There was nobody really supporting her besides these 6 relatively powerless, moderate Republican senators.
Some
And
might
yet
call
she
them
stood up.
dwarfs.
Somebody might call them dwarfs. So Joe McCarthy afterwards disdained her by calling her Snow White and her 7 dwarfs, or her 6 dwarfs. He attacked her by going after her when she was running for re-election. He did everything he could to make her life miserable by kicking her off of his subcommittee, and yet she stood up to him. And Margaret Chase Smith, who you know much better than me, was an avowed anti-communist, stood up to him by saying the worst thing of all, which is, it's not your communist crusade that I object to, it's your crusade being a fraud that I object to. So she sounded this declaration of conscience. And I say, of all the things Margaret Chase Smith is known for, half a century later, her most proud moment was that moment in standing up to the all-powerful Senator Joe McCarthy when nobody else seemed willing to do it, not even the all-powerful Dwight Eisenhower. So I think she was an extraordinary presence in doing this. And I think if we remember her for nothing else, in your library, we'll make sure we remember her for a lot else. But if we remember her for nothing else, it would be enough having authored this Declaration of Conscience against Joe McCarthy.
So how can people get this biography of Joe McCarthy?
So the trademark, the standard answer that any author would give is go on to Amazon and it's easy to order it. I would encourage people to not do that. If you want to buy the book, go to any independent bookstore in the great state of Maine or anywhere else, and it's there everywhere, very easy to order it. And I will say self-servingly, I would not say buy the book, but I would say if you buy the book and you want an autograph, my email is my name, LARRYTYE, as one word, at gmail.com. Shoot me an email. I will send you an autograph. And I would suggest one more thing that is not self-serving, but go to the great Margaret Chase Smith Library when it is safe to be there and read about Margaret Chase Smith's shining moment when she took on this all-powerful demagogue, because what she did is not just a matter of historical interest, it is a matter of interest to today. We have too few people in the Senate or anywhere else who will stand up to demagogues when they're at the height of their power, and she is a role model for that.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much for that shout out. And I'll just follow on by saying that we are technically open by appointment. So people really are anxious to come and read up more about Margaret Chase Smith. They can always give us a call and make arrangements for that. So as people are browsing on Amazon or perhaps going to the local independent bookstore and seeing that you've written some other biographies. Do you want to mention, we've referred to your Satchel Paige biography, which I'm noting there is a picture of it behind your right shoulder.
There is indeed. So,
and you've done one on Bobby Kennedy as well. Any other that you want to mention?
Sure. So I will mention really quickly that I wrote a biography that was in part something that proved very useful for this book about a man named Edward L. Bernays, the so-called father of public relations. And it's a
Mhm.
book called The Father of Spin. And I think if Edward Bernays was the father of spin, Joe McCarthy was the son of spin.
Mhm.
And one other book that I want to mention, because it inspired so much of what I've done in writing, was a book on the Black men called Pullman Porters,
Mhm.
who I think gave birth not just to the first Black trade union, but in many ways to the civil rights movement. And I want to say that they inspired my next book, which I'm working on now, which is a biography of three of the most famous men, I think, in the world of music, but also in the world of civil rights, which we don't often think of them as. And it's a biography of three jazzmen named Duke Ellington, Satchel Armstrong, and Count Basie.
Oh, very good. And so that was going to be my final question. You always want to ask the author, what's the next project you're working on? And that's it.
So that is it. And my reward to me from my publisher and my reward to myself after having spent 3 long years with Joe McCarthy is
Mhm.
to spend 3 wonderful years with Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie.
And when do you hope to have this published?
When do I have to have it out to meet
Okay.
my deadline?
Yes.
It has to be out. So these days, I'm taking 2.5, 3 years to write a book. And so I hope just before the next presidential election. McCarthy came out just before the last one.
Hmm.
I'm sorry. And this next one, I hope to come out just before Joe Biden is running for reelection in the year 2024.
Well, the campaigning will start in 23, but yes, the electing will start in 24.
Exactly.
Very
So I
good.
really appreciate, I encourage everybody to do it safely during the pandemic and to do it regularly after the pandemic, to go to the great Margaret Chase Smith Library.
And I encourage people to read the biography as I was thumbing through it. It's very well written. It's very well researched. You had this benefit of gaining access to material that other people hadn't seen before. And one of the things I did on Amazon, you can actually listen to a section of it. And to me, good writing sounds good, and it sounds good. You like something that I like, alliteration.
So I like alliteration. I also like something that you like, which is a good story of our past that helps tell us the story about where we are today. And I think
Mhm.
that the John McCarthy story initially looked to me like a story of ancient history, and
Mhm.
nobody would think it's a story of just ancient history today.
Yeah. Well, and we only touched on it lightly. You highlight it more in the book, especially in the introduction, the connections to Donald Trump.
Yes. So Donald Trump is in the book only in the preface and the epilogue, but one could argue he's there every page of the book.
Hmm. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us, and I hope you have happy holidays.
So it was a pleasure to be with you, and I hope you have the same happy holidays.
All right, and good luck with the next project. We'll be on the lookout for it.
Terrific.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.